This de minimis exemption is something that you looked at and actually got rolling in the Biden administration. Are you worried about what it means for consumer prices?
At this juncture in time, I'm a little bit worried because it will raise prices. And one thing we found is that the incidence of the de minimis rule falls largely on middle and lower income households. And they're the very ones who disproportionately have imports in their market basket. If you look at who buys more imports as a share of their income, it's folks in the bottom half. And that's why the incidence of this tax we call tariffs is really a very regressive one. It hits middle and lower income people. That said, I considered it a loophole, and I think loopholes should generally be closed.
Fascinating. Well, I guess it's over now. And I wonder what your thoughts were today when you saw this emergency hearing scheduled and conducted. It finished with no decision. You've got a Federal Reserve governor going into this long weekend of Labor Day wondering what's going to happen to her job status, and a president who believes that she should already be fired. How is this going to end?
It's just a remarkable set of events, and the threat to the Federal Reserve is higher than I've ever seen it in terms of their independence. Putting aside the pretext around the documents that are in question here, there is no one should at all question that this is anything more than a power grab by the president to take over the interest rate, in particular machinations of the Federal Reserve. And that just couldn't be more dangerous. It's going to be terrible for households and consumers who are going to face higher inflation and higher interest rates. But internationally, when creditors to the United States start to recognize that there's been political interference in this really heretofore protected institution, that's going to end badly for us as well. So very serious problem.
When you were at the White House, which was not that long ago, you wouldn't even answer questions when we would ask you your thoughts on anything
hard as you tried.
Surrounding the Fed. We tried every time we talked to you. We're in a different world now, and I'm wondering, to the extent that you know these individuals and have worked with the Fed over the years, what this means internally, the culture of the Fed. It's not just Lisa Cook. It's the visit to the Eccles building. It's the demands that Jay Powell step down, the nickname Too Late Powell. There's been a denigration, at least in terms of the rhetoric coming from this administration. What are they talking about in the building?
It's a really important question. I'm not in the building, but I can tell you that when I was back in the White House and interacting with the Federal Reserve, that firewall between politics and monetary policy was something that we both deeply, deeply respected, both sides. And the reason is because we know the history of what occurs when central bank independence is compromised. I mean, I could point you to 80% inflation at Turkey when Erdogan got up to his fun and games there, but it's been repeated throughout history, including our own with Arthur Burns and Nixon. So it was always very clear that that political firewall was not a cultural thing, it was an economic thing. And the history of Federal Reserve independence, central bank independence, is very, very clear, particularly through the inflation channel. You compromise federal independence, and higher inflation walks in very quickly.
There's independence, of course, and the market's concerned about that. Then there's the matter of public trust. And to come at this from the other way, if we find out, and I know you're not a lawyer, I'm not going to try to make you a legal analyst, but there's apparently a third mortgage application, according to the administration. It's not going to make her case any easier. At what point does this become damaging to a public wondering what these Federal Reserve governors are doing?
I think we have to leave that to play out in the courts. It's a totally fair question. And look, we may have to have two thoughts that we hold in our heads simultaneously. One is that there were problems there, and if that's what the records show, then they should be worked out in court accordingly, and they should be treated very much in keeping with the culture of the Fed to be very pristine in this area of financial oversight. The much bigger issue is Trump trying to compromise central bank independence, trying to put his own people on the board, trying to get a majority there in time to perhaps act against regional Fed presidents to take over the Fed in ways that will be massively damaging to not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy. And that is a much bigger deal than Lisa Cook's paperwork.
Well, you know, we've got a confirmation hearing set for next week for Stephen Myron. And apparently he's going to be at this next meeting in September, which is light speed around here. Will she?
I really can't answer that. That's a question for the lawyers, and it's what they were tangling with today. Look, one thing I will say, listening to the legal discussion as a non-lawyer, is that none of this sounds like it was for cause in the type of for cause that I believe the drafters of the Federal Reserve Act were thinking of. The idea of malfeasance, of doing your job on monetary policy badly. Making mistakes on your mortgage paperwork, intentional or otherwise, I'm not going to trivialize that. I'm not going to speak to it. I don't know the extent of the problem there. That all happened before she was on the Fed. And the for cause, to me, sounds a lot like the for cause criterion sounds a lot like what you were doing when you were a Federal Reserve governor. And there she's been exemplary.
Interesting. Wow. So the expectation is that we get a quarter-point cut in September. You think it's justified?
At this point, I do, and that's because of the job market. So I actually looked at the data, the price data this morning, and thought it militated a bit against that in the sense that we just have some really sticky inflationary problems that just remain in this economy, and some of that's the tariffs. But we also saw inflationary pressures in services in a way that's pretty hard to connect to the tariffs. So I understand I don't think a rate cut in September is a slam dunk. However, if it's true that the underlying pace of job growth in payrolls is 35K a month, that's way too low to keep the unemployment rate from rising. And so I would give that more weight if I were thinking about September at this point.
Okay. We've only got about a minute left. The president thinks we should cut by 150 to, I believe, 175 basis points. He may have actually suggested 300 basis points at one point. If that actually happened, what would be the impact, not on the market, but on the economy?
I think you'd really see an unleashing of inflation, and I also think you'd see just an absolute conclusion that the president has taken over the Federal Reserve.
Well, okay.
Because the Fed would never...
I mean, that would be an alternate universe.
It'd be an alternate... The Fed would never endorse a cut of that magnitude given the conditions that we have now. So it would be, in the near term, it'd be pretty destructive. And again, there's lots of historical examples of inflation going through the roof when politicians take over. But the bigger problem, the longer-term problem would be just a sign, surrender, white flag, it's over, the president took over.